First of all, this is an interesting conference because there's a lot of people from different areas and different disciplines. And when I got home last night, my wife asked me what the conference was like. I said, well, you know, as a Spanish speaker, imagine you go to a movie. And you're really happy to see the movie. But when you get into the cinema, what you find out is that the movie is in Italian. So you are actually from Spanish, it's not that far from Italian. You get part of the message, you don't get other parts of the message. You miss some of the small points, you get some of the big points. And it's a bit like this conference. So I excuse myself in saying that I probably missed half the points that were made, but that's trouble of background. There was one point, however, that struck me interesting, which the words heuristics and biases have been used in quite different senses. In one sense, reference was made to the Heuristics and Biases program. And that was the program of research initiated by Kahneman and Tversky, in which they tried to show that by using heuristics, i.e. improper rules for making decisions, people sometimes made the right decisions, but very often screwed up. And they came up with a heuristics called availability, representativeness, and anchoring and adjustment. This is quite different from the bias and the heuristics that Gigerens is talking about. Gigerens is talking about heuristics in the sense of rules for making decisions which are incomplete, but useful. Oh, yes, Gert's coming. Good. I'm just saying okay. Gert, I'm going to speak for you, so you better be careful. I was making the point that the use of the words heuristics and biases have been used in quite different senses in this conference, and that people who are not in the field would have trouble understanding that. Gert's use of heuristics is a rule for making a decision which is not complete, ignores some information, etc., etc. He uses bias not in the sense of a bias and a judgmental bias, but in the sense of a part of the error in a prediction, and to work it out. So his heuristic and bias is not the same as the heuristic and bias of Kahneman and Tversky. That's what I wanted to say about that, to clarify that point. Let me talk a little bit about each of the three papers that we had, and then come back and make some general points. In Gert's paper, Savage's small world is really very small. And one of the messages he keeps hitting us is a good point, but I think Gert has actually misled us somewhat. I think most of the decisions we make are small. Whether you have a coffee, don't have a coffee. Whether you go to the post office, don't go to the post office. A lot of the decisions we make are small. And if I wanted to improve decision-making quality, if I could improve the quality of small decisions by a small amount, in aggregate, I could have a huge impact on people's lives. So the notion of the small decisions as being sort of write them off, I think is a bit premature. I'm not saying that the small decision-making, decision theory kind of be applied to everything, but I think that we meet sufficient number of small decisions in the world that makes it able to do that. So that was a small thing. The second point on Gert's paper, which I really liked actually, was the article he talked about supporting the view that violations of coherence and consistency don't make people worse off. He quotes the paper by Arcus himself and Hertwig, which I really thoroughly recommend to everybody, in which they go through systematically the literature on biases, violations of axioms, and show that actually violating the actions doesn't actually have much impact. I always think of it in terms of the money pump argument. The money pump argument is often given as a reason why you should be coherent in your probabilities. But I think if once somebody realizes that they have made one money pump situation, they're not going to consistently continue in that process afterwards. So there's a real problem there with that example. So I like the idea of this, but I recommend that paper. Now, one of the things we've been talking about is ecological rationality. And one of the things is not always quite defined, but what do we mean by that? By ecological rationality, we mean a rule, a match between a decision rule and an environment. And it has happened. Now, what does it take to get to something to be ecologically valid? It takes a lot of trials. So basically, it's not as though you can immediately say, this rule is ecologically valid, this one isn't. It's new. and the environment is new. So one of the great things that I think, has been missing from the conference and from our papers is the whole notion of how do people learn that certain rules are ecologically valid or not. And so the whole issue of learning is something which we have not talked about very much. When and why are heuristics successful? That's the big issue that Gerd has been asking in his work, and I think that's very important. He makes an important contribution to talking about the bias and variance trade-off, which was not obvious until a few years ago. And he also has shown how certain kinds of decision rules are actually consistent with certain kinds of environments, and therefore why they would work well. So that, I think, is an important point. And I also like very much Gert's notion of an adaptive toolbox. I point out that it's not really a theory, it's more of a metaphor. And a metaphor is very useful. And one of the things I will point out before we leave this afternoon is I think metaphors of how we look at our decisions is really very critical. Now, those are the sort of initial points I wanted to make about Gert's work. Let me talk a little bit about Annika's work. I can find where I wrote it down. Here we are. Okay. Annika starts off with a discussion of ought implies can. I think that ought implies can is one of the great statements of decision theory. Because basically, how can you actually be held responsible if you cannot do it physically, make things? So the ought behind can is really, so all our work has to be done under the notion of ought behind can. And this raises the issue of to whom should the concept of rationality apply, and under what conditions should the concept of rationality apply. There have been some interesting studies done in recent years of poor people, poverty. Eldar Shafir and others have done some work, and they show that poor people have a lot of problems in making decisions because of lack of education, very often. Not so much lack of money, but lack of education. And I think finding out the notion of varying people by levels of education is probably a good one to do. One of the other interesting examples, which didn't come up in the conference, but which the paper by Annika made me think, was the Friedman Savage example of the billiard player. When asked who was rational. If you're a billiard player, what does it mean to make a rational hit in billiards? Well, it requires lining the ball up perfectly, and you can imagine theoretically making a kind of calculation, right? How do I actually do it? But in fact, you don't actually do it that way. You actually do it through experience, and that's where learning comes in. And so different levels of billiard players depend on levels of learning, which is why learning is an important point. And Annika asked what would be a test of everyday rationality. And she took the notion of shopping as a test of everyday rationality. But it really wasn't a test of rationality, if I may say so, because a number of reasons. Number one, I don't think that I could say that the people were or were not rational at the end of that experiment. I wouldn't even say they were very good. I know that she said they were pretty good, but I don't think that 70% was necessarily very good. But on the other hand, they were good in the sense that they weren't looking at a lot of information. But we can't really tell whether the 70% was good unless we had some other kind of measures. So if we had some models, some drones or something, or some robots going through using certain methods of doing things and coming out and seeing how good they are, then I could judge how good the people were. But I think that's an interesting notion. When we went into grocery shopping, one of the best studies of grocery shopping I know of is the study done by Russo many years ago, which looked at the effect of information in grocery shopping. What Russo looked at was the effect of unit prices. Unit prices are usually placed on products. So you can go up, pick up the product, see what the unit price is, and put it down, etc. What Russo did was arrange with a supermarket to put the unit price in a list at the end of the aisle, rank ordered by size. So people could go up to the list and look and see what was everything by unit price. And what did he find? Guess what the results of that experiment were? Stores that had unit prices that way made less money. So basically, they decided that basically after that it was a bad idea to put unit prices in that format, and in which case they went back to their old thing, and that ended it. So that was an important, interesting. But I think supermarkets are a great place to do studies, particularly because you can control the information as you showed with the eyeglasses. Okay, one other point to raise. Question for me, Annika's page raised to me was how to develop appropriate criteria for rationality. She didn't answer the question per se, but I think the paper raised it, because I think, and I'll come back and talk about that shortly. Let me see. Trouble of being a discussion, you have to go back and see what they actually said. Okay. Yeah, Annika talked a lot about guidelines. What she wanted to do is present guidelines, but I didn't actually see where the guidelines were. You were talking about presenting guidelines for doing various things, but I couldn't actually see how that came into, as a resulted from what you actually did. Am I wrong? Oh, I don't mind. Yeah, why not? I must admit, I had a lot of trouble understanding, like Gert, at the end. I thought it was terrific that you were actually looking at the adaptive toolbox. That basically you were not just thinking about whether the actual use of a decision rule was actually okay, but also whether or not the actual toolbox could work. And I thought you'd proved at first that it could work, but then you seem to say it didn't. But that was a discussion which we will have to get back into later on. But I think that approach was actually very interesting. And for me, it was a totally new kind of approach. So that was another reason I found it interesting. I have a doctoral student who recently completed his PhD looking at the issues of learning in that environment. And he was trying to see whether or not subjects could learn in a sort of a multiple cube probability learning kind of situation, whether they could learn that they were in a different environment, and how quickly it took them to shift over from one environment to the other. So I think there's a lot of room for experimental work in learning, which could come up out of the work that you're describing. So I like that. Okay, let me then say now more general comments. I think that the word rationality has to go. I think it just has too much, it has just too much baggage. For example, we say, is the President of the United States and the President of North Korea, are they rational? Well, that's the kind of the level at which I think we've got to now. And I'm not answering answer the question to that, but when you say rational, it's kind of an emotional term, right? Because they could be personally rational according to game theory ideas, but we don't know that. So I prefer actually to think about this in a totally different way. What I think about it in the sense is the following. I work in decision-making, behavioral decision-making, and what we are interested in is how do people make decisions, and secondly, how can you help people make better decisions? And I would propose basically that what we should be interested in is the quality of decisions rather than the rationality. And I would break down quality as having two components. A component is procedural, so procedural quality, and a component is ecological quality. By procedural quality, I would mean have people follow the procedures you would want them to follow in actually making the decision, i.e. not just doing it at random, so on and so forth. And by ecological quality, I would mean to what extent do those procedures follow the real world. And I would argue that procedural and ecological quality would have to be assessed in three different stages. One stage is at the level of specification of the problem, specification. Second is the level of inputs. And third, the level of aggregation of information. Now, one of the interesting things is that one of those levels is completely missing from our discussions today, which is the specification of the problem. Most of the time, most of the work we've looked at today, I'd say 99.9% of the work has looked at the problem after it's been defined and it was being solved, or not being solved, or being or input or aggregation is taking place. But the actual rationality or quality of the specification has not been solved. I'm always reminded about that when I think about a problem. Remember the famous trolley problem. In this scenario, a trolley is hurtling down a track towards a workmen who are unaware of its presence. The trolley will pass under a bridge on which you are standing, and you can stop it by dropping a heavy weight on its path. Near to you on the bridge is a very fat man. Pushing him off the bridge in front of the trolley would stop it, and thus save 5 lives. Would you push the man off the bridge? So here's a problem. It's set up as you can either push a man off the bridge and kill him, or let the trolley kill 5 workers on the track. What do? Well, it's a well-known problem in philosophy, I understand, but what do you do? Well, the question is, why do you accept that definition of the problem? Why don't you say, so rather than face it, why don't you come up with another alternative solution? An alternative solution could be jump yourself off onto the track. and save the capital that way. But,
if you're too small?
well, assuming you're big enough, put money in your pocket. If you're big enough, like you are, but you have to be big enough. You have to be big enough to push the fat man off. Okay. But what I'm trying to say is that I think the notion of that problem is the way the problem is specified up front by the giver is accepted by the decision maker, and the decision maker shouldn't accept the specification, but should come and find a new specification of the problem. And that's part of the rationality of it. In terms of inputs, you can look at inputs both in terms of procedures and in terms of ecology. The thing of the inputs could be things like probabilities, what's the procedure you use for getting the probabilities, or alternatively, it could also be ecologically, how good are the probabilities, how close are the probabilities to what's happening. So for example, that goes quite against the notion of coherence. Coherence says that you judge basically a decision by coherence, so you're not going to worry whether or not the probabilities are actually in agreement with the real world. You're just going to see whether there's a consistency in a person's argument. And I'm arguing that that's not, you can't get away with that. And similarly, as for the inputs, you get to aggregation, and you have different levels of making aggregation. One actually point to go back to Gert's paper. Gert talked about Howard Rafer and Ralph Keeney's book, 1993, I think, right? Well, actually, there's a 1992 book by Keeney, which is very interesting, called Value-Focused Thinking, which actually is not a sort of decision theory book in the way you usually think about it, but he actually shows you how you actually, by rethinking through how you construct your goals and alternatives, you can actually become more creative. And it's a very, very good book, and it helps a lot in terms of the idea of what I was talking about, the specification of the problem. So there is one actually very good book on the specification. Okay, finally, I'd just like to make a few words about metaphors. We've talked about metaphors of decision-making. Savage used a gambling metaphor, and that gambling metaphor has been used a lot. But there are other metaphors you could use for making decisions. One of the metaphors I like is what I call the foggy minefield. The idea is this. What's decision-making like? Well, decision-making is like crossing a minefield in the fog. It's dangerous. You can sometimes see part of the way. Sometimes you can blow your foot off if you're not careful, and so on and so forth. But it captures lots of dimensions of decision-making. Think of an example of the following. Imagine that you are 25 years old and you're setting out in your career. How are you going to plan your decisions across your lifetime? Nobody can do that, right? It's impossible. But it's a bit like the foggy minefield. You're going to go across in a different kind of way, keep changing, and so on and so forth. So that is a totally different metaphor of decision-making. It's not decision-making as tossing a coin and seeing which way you go, but it's decision-making in a sort of a realistic kind of environment, but perhaps complex. It, of course, is not a complete metaphor, but it could be a useful way of thinking about it. So finally, I think that there are a number of questions posed by these papers. One is, I think, basically we should be defining new criteria for judging decisions and getting rid of rationality. I'm not sure exactly what I've suggested some ideas, but they're very small ideas. I think the whole issue of specification issues are important. And one of the big issues in decision-making, I think, which is when are shortcuts reasonable? We've been talking a lot about heuristics, but how do you construct a heuristic so that shortcuts, what's reasonable about it? And finally, I think the whole issue of training decision makers is something which we haven't talked about. It gets into the learning as well. Well, that's the points I wanted to make.
Thank you very much. You go first.
So thank you very much for your comments. So first a clarification question and then a follow-up on your specification, the issue of specification. So you said before that you said we didn't really consider learning, but I think you also corrected that later. So my clarification question is: did you understand that the adaptation process, as I considered it, also involved learning? So it could be any kind of. Okay, so just wanted to clarify that.
But we didn't really sort of discuss human learning. That was a theoretical model you were making of the adaptation process.
Yeah,
right?
I like to think that my theoretical models are models of human learning. Under some very high idealization abstraction. And then on the specification, I really like to point this out, and it reminded, or at least how I understood it, is that you say so often we consider sort of that the problem space is defined. So the problem is well defined, and the question is how to actually then compute the solution, or the options are given, and then what is actually the rational thing to do. But you say, well, for decision making, just how you construe of the nature of the problem in the first place. And people may do that differently than, for instance, like an experimenter sets it. And this reminds me of work in insight problem solving, and I don't know to what extent this body of literature is familiar to rationality philosophers. I don't know in economics, so to what extent this is considered, but in problem solving research in psychology, there's a distinction between sort of searching a well-defined search space, like Herbert Simon and the Newell's work, or where actually even having a well-defined notion of the search space can actually hinder you in finding the process. And part of the solution is actually to reconceive of the problem. So I don't know if you maybe know the 9-dot problem. Did you hear of it? So I don't know if other people did. So this is a problem. You have 9 dots positioned in. Explain. Who knows the 9-dot problem? Yes, but not everybody. 9 dots in a square, and you have to connect them with 4 lines, and not take your pen off the paper, and then people get really, really stuck. And because they actually impose constraint that the person didn't say, that you have to stay within the boundary, and you need to figure out, I need to reconceive of the problem. Okay, so long story short. So my question back to you. So I think yes, indeed, this is really an ignored area, and explaining this actually computationally, I think, is even way harder than intractability. So I also like to research it, but it's even harder. And I'm wondering to what extent in economic theory, if you can comment on how this may apply.
Well, first of all, I want to correct something Thomas said. I'm not an economist.
Oh, okay.
I'm actually a psychologist. I work in a department of economics and business, but I'm actually a psychologist.
Okay, then maybe your perspective as psychologist in economics. So do you see a carryover of problem-solving research for consideration of specification in decision-making?
No. I would like it to be done, but I don't see it being done.
But do you? Okay, so it's not being done, but you think there's potential for it.
There's potential for it, yes, but I don't see it being done. But I think it's something that could be done and should be done.
Thanks.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to point out that Robin has written a wonderful chapter on why simple is hard to digest, and about his own experiences in trying to get the message that simple can sometimes be better than complex to the decision-making community. And maybe it might be of interest for all of you if you could say in 3 sentences about the resistance against your ideas.
Well, this is just a notion that I just did some case studies of cases where new ideas are brought forward and how have they been accepted. And one of the ideas I talked about was the equal weighting we discussed this morning, which Gert explained quite well. There's a question on too. And basically the notion here is that if you try to explain to people why equal weighting might be better than regression in certain circumstances, you get a knee-jerk reaction. Each year I try and teach it to PhD students in economics, and I get rejected completely because they've been so brainwashed in believing that least squares is the optimal solution. So I think one of the only thing you can do is, I think Fermi originally said, you have to wait till people die in order to be able to have those ideas come forward. But tremendous resistance to ideas that are simple just seem to be wrong to a lot of people. I'm not saying simple ideas are right. It's not avoiding the logical fallacy in that way, but just the notion that the simple ideas is quite strong.
Good. I guess that rounds it up. And thank you, everybody, for the discussions today.
Thank you.